So, what I wanted to, talk a little bit about today was to speak a little bit more about myself and what it is that I do here on Substack and what I do off of Substack on other platforms and in real life. And to dive in a little bit to one of the recent articles that I wrote and kind of expand on some of the ideas there. So, for those who do not know me, or who are encountering me for the first time, my name is Ellen Allen. I am a professional classical singer. I am a multi style voice teacher, and I am a content creator. And like I said, I've been here on Substack for about a year writing articles. And if you look back through my page and through my articles, you can see that a lot of them are about two main things, really, and the threads that connect these two main things. One is choral singing. So I do a lot of professional singing myself in choir contexts, especially small scale choir situations, although I sing in big concert choirs too. So I write a lot about choral singing, the skills required for choral singing, and the sort of specialty that this type of singing is, despite the fact that choirs are often thought of in the professional singing world, at least, often thought of as something that you do just for work or for solo opportunities. But really, how choral singing is its own art form. So that is one of the things that I talk about a lot. And how can we raise the standard collectively as classical artists who might be doing work in choral spaces or choral adjacent spaces? How can we raise the standard of excellence and the expectation of skill of the singers that take this kind of work and call themselves choral singers and do work in choirs. The other thing that I write a lot about is musical training itself, and I speak a lot to classical music training. So I'm talking about the Western classical tradition here, and I speak a lot about my experience as both a voice teacher myself, who has worked with students both young and old, both beginners and advanced, and both instrumentalists and vocalists, and how I see the dichotomy of that vocal instrumental training emerging in the professional classical world. I have experience in both forms of musical training. I was raised as a violinist. I played violin for many, many years. I started when I was 4 years old. I was Suzuki trained, and I had a very rigorous training, systematic training in this instrument. And when I became a singer, if you can say that, when I started singing more seriously in high school and especially in college, when I went to college to pursue singing specifically, I noticed a lot of differences in how instrumentalists and vocalists are trained. And I think that some of those differences are good and necessary, and I think some of those differences could really use a reframe and a restructure if we are talking about wanting to train classical singers to truly have the skills that they need to thrive in today's classical music industry. So those are the two things that if you look back at my Substack posts over the past year, I talk a lot about these things. I talk about choral singing and I talk about musical training, both pre and during the collegiate levels, and then how that pans out into the classical music industry as a whole. Now, the reason for this is because, not only is this the bulk of my experience as a professional musician, right? I do a lot of choral singing myself. I have voice teaching experience. I have, experience singing in the classical singing industry in a lot of other spheres other than choral. Um, not only is it a thing that I do a lot, they are things to which my skills are well suited and my qualifications are well suited for me to talk about these things. But I think that when it comes to both of these topics, and I think this is true for many topics, especially in the arts, but when it comes to these two topics, I think that there are things about them that speak to sort of like the more fundamental truths of what it means to be a human, what it means to be a human who creates things, what it means to be a human who is an artist and especially a performing artist, what it means to use one's voice, whether that is your literal voice, singing or speaking, or the voice that comes through when you play an instrument, or when you write, or when when you speak in front of people publicly. I think that there are fundamental truths that we can access when we really think about what underlies these topics and some of the issues that we see around them, some of the issues that we see, coming up at all levels, but also, some of the methods and the practical things that we use. How are they shaping not only the musicians that we are, but also the humans that we are? And so, I'm going to go a little bit into this and talk about, especially for today, I'm going to talk about sort of like the singer instrumentalist dichotomy when it comes to musical training, and how I think that we, especially in the vocal education world, can do a little bit more to help singers really become better artists, really become artists who have a deep knowledge of their skill set, in the same way that instrumentalists do. So, if you're watching this and you're like, "What is she even talking about?" Again, I will give a brief sort of like overview into my experience here. So like I mentioned before, I was a violinist. I trained very seriously as a violinist from ages 4 through about 16. So I was Suzuki trained in the very early years, and then I started to progress very, very rapidly and started studying with a very high level teacher. And when I was in middle school, my parents and my teacher decided that I was sufficiently advanced enough to enroll in a pre-conservatory program at a local conservatory here close to where I live, or where I lived at the time. And um, it was there that I got a very rigorous education, not only with technical training on the violin, but also with music theory. I played in orchestras. I got a lot of ear training and built a lot of musical skills, collaborating with pianists and things like that also. Um, and that was sort of my upbringing. And eventually, when I was a teenager, I decided I wanted to focus on singing instead. And I started to sing more regularly at school, in my high school choirs and in the select groups. And I decided to go to college to major in voice. And, since college, I have, been, doing all of the working singer things that you do when you graduate from school and you enter the industry. So, I have sung in, church choirs as a section leader. I've sung in large community groups. I've sung in semi-professional groups. I've sung in professional groups. I've done recital work. I've done chamber work. I've, built a voice studio from the ground up. I started teaching right after college and quickly sort of built a full time music studio teaching not only voice students, but violin and piano students as well. I no longer teach violin or piano, I teach voice only. And I work with mostly adult students these days. But I spent many years teaching very young students on all three instruments up through adult, and gained sort of a lot of experience observing how people think about the differences between vocal training and instrumental training. So not only do I see this playing out in my world as a singer myself and as a instrumentalist turned singer myself, but also in the students that I have worked with over the years. So I continued teaching full time while I was in graduate school, after I was in graduate school, and now I have a voice studio where, like I said, I work mostly with adult students. They sing classical music, they sing musical theater, they sing pop and rock and contemporary music. So styles that are sort of all over the musical world. So that is the lens that I place on all of these things. So myself, I am a classical musician as a performer. I have very little experience performing in non-classical styles, and that is by choice. I love classical music. I, believe that it has value. I believe that its traditions are beautiful. I believe that its music and its art is beautiful, and that is what I have chosen to use as my vehicle for my message as a performer. Um, That is not to say that it is more elite or more legitimate than other genres because it is not. It is just what I enjoy doing the most and what I feel called to do as a performer. However, I have much experience teaching these other styles to singers, and I have done a lot of, experimenting with my own voice and learning how to make those kinds of sounds, how to draw them out of other singers. And my students have had, quite a lot of successes over the years learning these non-classical styles as well. So that is where I am coming from when I talk about all of these things. So when I talk about things like the singer instrumentalist training dichotomy, which I will get into in just a moment, that is the lens from which I'm approaching this here. So recently, I wrote an article called "Breaking Down the Dumb Singer Stereotype." And, it's if you're not familiar with, sort of like the classical singing industry or music industry, the term "dumb singer" might sound very, very pejorative, and, I mean, it is objectively, it is insulting. But this is a stereotype that actually still somehow pervades the classical world, and nearly every classical singer has heard this before. There is this prevailing assumption that classical singers are less musically skilled and less well versed in sort of like the classical, I guess, tradition or something as a whole than their instrumentalist peers who have commensurate levels of training and experience. Um, and this is really sad because, obviously like, in conservatory, students are trained all in the same classes, right? Like, everyone goes to music theory, everyone goes to oral skills, everyone goes to, music history, everyone learns how to conduct, everyone learns how to do all these things, whether you are a singer or you are an instrumentalist. But there remains this sort of, this stereotype that, singers, lack these essential skills. And unfortunately, this is not a completely, unfounded stereotype because in my work as a professional musician, as a classical singer, I have seen this stereotype in action. Um, I cannot count, I've lost count of the number of times I have showed up to a gig, a rehearsal, whatever, church service, what have you, and I'm meeting the person running it for the first time, and they see me show up, and they expect me to be just, the soprano with the pretty voice, but no brains. And then they are consistently flabbergasted after hearing me sing, approximately 5 seconds of music and discover that I'm actually a very excellent musician. I sight read well, I have very good ensemble skills. Um, I'm very good at learning music quickly and synthesizing music quickly, but their expectation is always that I will need a lot of help, that I will need, like, a lot of hand-holding, and that instrumentalists do not need these things for whatever reason. And, I have seen this over and over and over again, not just with myself, but with other singers I have worked with, and my young students have even come to me and talk to me about this stereotype and how instrumentalists think that singers are dumb and they don't know anything and they don't actually have any skills and they just show up and open their mouths and that's that. They don't need to have anything else. Um, and it's too bad because I think that in my experience, this is nothing against singers whom I know personally. There are many, many singers I respect. But in my experience, singers are partially responsible for perpetuating this narrative. And that is because, for whatever reason, they do not take it upon themselves in the way that many instrumentalists do to really steep themselves in the things that will give them the foundation of those musical building blocks that they actually need to succeed as professional classical musicians. So I'm going to get into this a little bit here. And hang on. Okay, I'm going to get into this a little bit here because I have a theory as to why this is. So again, I am speaking to Western classical music here. Please do not attempt to put like a non-classical grid on this because like that is a completely different thing. So I want to first take a look at how things work at the collegiate level in terms of musical training and then work backward from there. And to start, I'm going to offer what is probably a bit of a hot take or a controversial statement here. And that is, for the most part, I don't believe that a lot of college level music training programs are actually good at teaching foundational musical skills. And I'm going to unpack this, and I'm just going to leave that there for a second. I do think that most college programs are quite good, actually, though, at helping musicians who already have a solid foundation in the basics to develop the higher level and more specific artistic skills they will need to thrive as professional musicians. I think that they are very good at doing that. That was certainly my experience, and that was certainly what I saw play out among my classmates and my peers when I was in school, both as an undergraduate and a graduate student, in fact. I think that a lot of college programs are actually quite good at providing musicians with like the technical training required for proficiency on their instrument. There's excellent teaching, private teaching in higher education at all kinds of schools, not just prestigious schools, but even the less prestigious schools have excellent, excellent instruction, including, lots of colleagues that I know and respect and trust very much. Um, but when it comes to helping students who come to college with little or no musical foundational experience, formal training in music, when it comes to helping those students excel and build the building blocks that they need in order to excel, I think there's a lot that there's a lot that we could do to make that better. So, a lot of people are like, well, obviously, like if people have never had musical training before and they're thrown into a conservatory environment for the first time, like obviously they're going to struggle, right? And like, yes, obviously. Um, but it's my theory is that it's not simply that they are new to studying music formally. My theory is that the system as it stands currently, it assumes that these students already have a strong foothold in the foundational basics of music, but for one reason or another, they do not. And this might not necessarily be their fault, right? So, there's a lot of reasons that students begin college with a wide, sort of variety of musical experience, or a wide span, I guess, of level of experience. And there are personal and individual reasons, and both and structural and systemic reasons that contribute to this situation. And I believe that there are ways that we can help close the gaps here, which I will talk about later. But for now, I just want to acknowledge that musically inexperienced students come to college, and the system already assumes that they have some knowledge of the foundational basics, and they don't for whatever reason. And this puts them at a very, very great disadvantage. So, you might be thinking like, why? College curricula, like they always start with the basics and then move on. And this was certainly my experience too, like going to college. Like we literally started from square one, like learning how to draw notes, like learning how to draw treble clefs and like draw notes on the staff and how long the stems had to be and, which direction they had to point and all of this stuff. Um, they start with like the very, very basic things. But the thing is that they progress very, very quickly beyond that point. So that is objectively true, but let's think about some of the other factors that contribute to this situation. So I think music, and especially Western classical music, is one of the most cumulative subjects that there is, meaning if you don't have that basic layer in place first, you can't build the next layer or the next layer or the next layer on top of that. It's kind of like math. Math functions the same way. If you don't learn to add or subtract, you can't learn to multiply or divide and then learn about fractions and percentages and all the advanced level math you learn as you go in school. So, it sounds like a no-brainer that you have to have that foundation layer in place first before you build on it. But, let's talk about actually, exactly what college students need to be able to do before they are thrown into the wilds of, advanced theory. And by advanced theory, I mean like theory, like level 2 and beyond, right? We're not talking like super, super, super heady, high level compositional techniques or anything like that. We're talking there's like anything that is beyond the first semester or maybe the first year of college theory. So here are some of the things that students have to know before they can begin to do all the more advanced stuff. They have to learn how to read notes on a staff. They have to do that in at least two clefs usually, right? Like treble or bass, maybe others as well. They have to learn what the most common musical symbols and markings are. So dynamics, articulation, expressive markings, and what they all mean. They have to learn how to notate notes and other musical symbols in a correct standard way. They have to understand note values in the various meters. They have to learn how to read, count, feel, execute basic rhythms. They'll have to learn how to break down complex meters. By complex meters, I mean things like, 9/8 or 6/8 or, things that are that are more complex than, say, just like a common time or a cut time or something like that. They have to be able to recognize intervals between pitches, both orally and visually. They have to understand key signatures, key relationships, circle of fifths. They have to understand how major and minor modes work and how they sound different from each other. They have to know the different types of minor mode. They have to know the names of the different scale degrees, right? Like tonic and subdominant, dominant, things like that. How those degrees function. And they have to be able to solfege their way through a really simple diatonic exercise, like very, very simple. So that is already a lot of stuff, right? That is a lot of stuff to know how to do by the time you get to college. But when we are talking about singers who want to enter, or any musician, frankly, who wants to enter their professional sphere doing performing work or any work as a musician, these are really basic things. These are really basic things. We haven't even gotten to things like simple four-part writing, harmonic analysis, like recognizing musical forms, taking dictation, learning how music modulates, how to sight read actual music. That is like a whole other discussion in and of itself, and how sight reading is taught. Everything else you learn in, theory level 2 and beyond. You can't do any of that stuff if you don't have any of those basic things in place. By the basic things, I mean that whole big list that I just mentioned. And here is the thing that people often don't think about. And I think some musicians know this intuitively, but others, especially if they're new to music and they're overwhelmed, they don't realize this. And that is when you want to be able to do music at a professional level, you need to go beyond just knowing the basic things simply as concepts on an intellectual level. You need to go beyond that and know them inside and out, such that your brain can begin to automate some of these basic things as you progress to more complex music and more complex theory. Okay? You need to know, you need to go beyond just knowing them, and they need to be internalized. And I believe that any musician can get to this point. Any musician can do this, but it takes time, and it takes lots of time. And the thing about college is that you don't have time. It takes years and, I think about my own experience, like decades, right? For these things to sink in deeply enough to be applicable to a young or inexperienced musician in any meaningful way, right? It's, if you start music young, you're exposed to these concepts from a very young age. If you come to music for the first time in college, you are trying to put all these pieces together in a very, very short amount of time. That's the thing about college. You don't have time. You have a semester at best to master all of these things. And I do mean master them, because you can't, like I said, you can't build the next level until you've mastered the level underneath it. They have a matter of weeks, to learn and synthesize these things at such a level that they can progress from being just concepts that they know to becoming actual useful tools in the toolbox, and serve as the foundation for those higher level skills that you need to actually be a proficient professional musician. So this, I believe, is why students with pre-college musical backgrounds, people like myself who had music from a very young age, this is why they progress faster than their peers who are new to music when they go to college. Not only have they had previous exposure, but in many cases, they started doing music very young. So that exposure has been consistent and ongoing over the course of years, not mere months or weeks, like it is for these people who study these things for the first time in college. So their young brains have had lots of time, adequate time to understand the basic musical building blocks. And they've had an opportunity to steep themselves in these concepts, even if that is just like subconsciously or like through osmosis, studying another instrument. And they have had time to engage with them in a way that, whatever way is applicable to the instrument that they are studying. I like to think of it as becoming fluent in a second language. I am a little bit of a language nerd, and I've studied a lot of languages, and I've more recently been looking into the theory of how language is acquired and how we learn language. And when you think about how you become fluent in a language that is not your mother tongue, uh, what does it take? It takes repeated, consistent exposure and periods of immersion, right? To become truly conversationally fluent, you have to be steeped in it. It has to be surrounding you, often over a period of years, or at the very least, like several months, right? An intensive experience of several months. And, once you become conversant in the basics of that language, there are like higher levels to learn, right? There's more advanced vocabulary and grammar. There's, specialized terms for like, say, whatever field you work in, for example, and idioms, so many idioms in every language. You don't learn these things at the basic level. That's like level 2 and 3 and beyond. So studying music is really similar to that. Those who have had the opportunity for that immersion experience, to immerse themselves deeply in music. And even its most basic mechanics, those are the ones who are, conversationally fluent by the time they get to college, which means that they are immediately ready, or they are at least ready a lot sooner, to engage with the more advanced music theory required for, professional level proficiency. So when we think about this fundamental layer and what's required to learn it, and when we think about what happens when that is like rushed or compressed, right? It often creates gaps in learning because it's overwhelming. You're trying to synthesize a fire hose of information, just in order to keep up. And I think this is the position that a lot of college music students find themselves in. So they're being rushed through this rigorous 4-year curriculum where they are expected to internalize these musical basics. And they might learn them well enough to pass the class, but not necessarily well enough to apply them to real world music, right? Like, say, their own repertoire, for example, in a way that will actually help them learn and understand and synthesize that music better, right? And, so that it doesn't feel just like a mere academic exercise. And I think that is the disconnect. It's going from this is an academic exercise we do in class to learn how major and minor modes work to this is, a piece of music that I look at now and I understand these concepts deeply enough and they are internalized enough for me to recognize how the major and minor modes are at work or at play in this particular piece of music, right? That is the difference. And that is, I think, the disconnect that a lot of people face. So, going back to our stereotype, our very insulting, pejorative stereotype of the dumb singer who has no musical skills. If we look at one of the elephants in the room here, a lot of the students who begin college without this strong foundation in musical mechanics, a lot of them are singers. And a lot of the students who begin college with a strong foundation in those musical basics, they are instrumentalists. And again, this was my experience as an instrumentalist turned singer. I had the musical building blocks already. I'd had, the equivalent of Theory 2 and Theory 3 in middle school. My peers who were singers, my classmates who were singers, matriculating the same year that I was into the same classes, had never had any of this stuff before. They had tons of vocal potential. They were very good singers. They were very good, stage actors, but they didn't have some of these foundational skills. So why is this? So I already talked about my background and, my journey is, starting violin very young and coming up through the Suzuki method where I was trained by ear a lot. But what that actually meant, right, is that, from a young age, I was absorbing concepts like diatonicism. I was absorbing things like musical forms because I was learning a lot of the pieces by rote. I was learning how to play in tune and thus how intonation works and how, what does it mean to be in tune versus out of tune. These were concepts that I was engaging with immediately on a sort of organic level, almost a subconscious level, as I learned how to become technically proficient on my instrument, on my violin. And then, eventually I started learning how to read music and I excelled very quickly because I already had those oral skills in place first. I already knew what music was supposed to sound like. I already knew what it meant to be in tune. I already knew how to execute rhythms with my bow on the string. I already knew how to move my fingers in a way to produce the pitches that I wanted. So when I learned to read music, I started to move very, very quickly. And that is when, my parents and my teacher were like, let's get this girl some more instruction and some more like holistic musical formation here. Um, so I was learning all the advanced theory once I enrolled in the pre-conservatory program, and I was also advancing technically on my instrument. And now here's the thing about advancing technically on an instrument that is not your human voice, right? So I'm talking about any instrument, like I'm talking about violin, piano, clarinet, trumpet, it doesn't matter. Instrumentalists have things in their regular practice routine, in their regular diet of musical exercises. They have things like scales, etudes, and studies designed not only to help them solidify technical concepts on their instrument, but to get them familiar with, for example, playing in all of the different keys. Internalizing various musical gestures, rhythmic gestures, internalizing various sort of styles of music. So I think, for example, of the Carl Flesch scale system, which is like the violinist's Bible or the string player's Bible, because all string players use it, not just violinists. But this book is you think, oh, it's a scale book. It's like, it's a scale book. What's a big deal? It's a scale book and it's about this thick. And the reason for that is because you have scales in all of the keys, major and minor keys, and there is a systematic way of moving through all of those keys. So for each key, for each major and minor key, you have a 4-octave scale with a specific fingering to learn. You have a series, like a set of 6 or 7 different arpeggios that go with that scale. Then you have double stop scales of thirds, sixths, octaves, and tenths. You have scales of harmonics, and you have chromatic scales. So what all of this means is that inside of a single key, inside of a single tonal world, E flat major, C sharp minor, whatever it is, you are engaging with that tonal world in such a deep, meticulous way that it becomes internalized as far as not only the key signature, like how many flats or sharps are in the signature itself, but how those intervals interplay with each other, especially when you're working with double stop scales and you can do 2 notes at a time. For those who aren't string players, that's what a double stop is. It's when you play 2 notes simultaneously. So you get one finger on one string and one finger on another string. And you hear a nice, like, harmonious sound. And it's very fiendishly difficult to get double stops to be in tune. By, working the technical aspects required to play the double stops in tune, you are also internalizing note relationships, scale degree relationships, and as you move through the book, throughout the different keys, key relationships that help you like build that foundational layer of building blocks. So you are learning by osmosis that circle of fifths, your key signatures, key area relationships, and so forth that are going to pay dividends when you end up in a college oral skills class to sight read those, little exercises that come in the sight reading book. And like I said, this is very, very standard for all instrumentalists who study at a serious level. Even if you only make it to intermediate level, say, like I taught many violin students over the years who kind of made it to intermediate level and then they, stopped or they moved on to other things. But even they uh, gained experience with scales on their instrument and what it meant to play in these different keys. And their playing overall improved because of it. Their intonation improved because of it. Their playing of their pieces, whatever, concertos or sonatas or things that they were working on, improved because they were doing not only these exercises that were designed for technical improvement, but for musical improvement as well, overall understanding of how music works. Um, so, to a lot of singers, that sounds like a lot. It sounds like a lot of training, but it is not. It is very standard for instrumentalists who play at an intermediate level or above. So now I want to contrast this a little bit with how a lot of singers are trained. So, I'm making generalizations here, and I realize that, but I am also coming at this as a voice teacher myself, and I have been teaching long enough. I've been teaching some 15 years now, and I know what the pedagogical trends in the industry are. And I have seen how these trends have played out, when I do things like adjudicate the NATS student auditions, or when I attend, a colleague student's recitals, or any time that I see young singers, I see the results of a lot of these trends. So yes, they are generalizations, but generalizations are also based in a bit of truth. So when compared with instrumentalists, first of all, a lot of singers don't begin studying privately until later in life. And by later in life, I mean that they might be like 10 as opposed to 4, or maybe they're 12 years old as opposed to 6 or something like that. Or maybe they're even teenagers before they begin studying voice in any serious way. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I think part of it is that parents of young students often think that instruments like piano or guitar or violin or something are more beneficial somehow to the student when they are younger. It's more worthwhile to study those things than it is to learn how to sing at that age. I'm not going to get into my opinions on that. I'm just kind of laying that out there as a reason. Um, there is the other thing too, where singers' voices, just because of how human development happens, there is just the reason, or the reality, I guess, that your voice doesn't mature until you are much older. So you can play very technically advanced repertoire on an instrument at a young age. Whereas if you are a singer, you have to save a lot of that technically advanced work uh, for when your voice is ready for it, especially if you are singing classical music. Because if you try to push too much of that difficult repertoire on the singer too early on in their journey, they can end up with some vocal issues and problems later on. At the very least, they end up with a lot of technical issues that need addressing when their voices are finally ready to do that. And then, there also still exists among some voice teachers this notion that students shouldn't study singing, like singing technique when they are young, and they should wait until they're older to do that. Again, I'm not going to get into my opinions on that here. I'm just, again, laying it out as a reason. I did write a separate related post on this, which maybe I'll do a live on that at some point, and sort of just like, people's preconceptions about music study is another discussion. So that's the thing. That's the first thing is singers. They often come to their private study, much later in life than instrumentalists do. And when they do, finally, a lot of their formal training is focused on technique. So singers, if you think about it, they do a lot of technical work um, independent of actual music. They do a lot of technical work independent of actual music. So I'm talking about things like vocalises and exercises that are designed to help singers, solidify various techniques in isolation without the additional demands of a musical context, right? Um, and these exercises, they are based on scale patterns, arpeggio-like things, but the purpose is almost always purely technical. It is not approached in the same way that scales and arpeggios are in the instrumental practicing world, which not only are building technique but are building basic musicianship skills. Like familiarity with keys and key areas and so forth. So this is not a good or a bad thing. This doing independent technical work right outside of actual music. It's not a good or a bad thing. But it is a reality that we have to address, and we have to address the implications of that reality because it does mean that by and large, most singers' technical private training is not it's not aimed at primarily a systematic synthesis of basic musical building blocks because their technical material does not contain a lot of the inherent musicianship building skills that an instrumentalist technical training an instrumentalist, technical training does. Then, when it comes to repertoire, a lot of young singers are encouraged to learn their music by listening to recordings. Um, and that is certainly a valuable thing. Like, recordings absolutely have their place in the music learning process. I use them. I encourage my students to use them. But when the students are young, especially, there is a lot of what I feel undue emphasis placed on learning your music from recordings. And that kind of solidifies the idea in the student that learning how to read the music in front of them is not actually important. Because if you can just listen to it, why bother to learn what all of these symbols and dots and lines mean, right? Um, I realize that there are a growing number of voice teachers, thankfully, who do incorporate things, like sight singing and basic music theory, into their voice lessons with their young singers. Um, but this kind of very contained exposure, just a few minutes in a lesson, like each week or every other week or whatever, does not have the same effect as doing these things daily. So it's, they're learning how to sight read little exercises, but again, that's not translating to how they might learn their own repertoire, right? Which is obviously musically more complex than the exercises. No one's connecting the dots about how they might use that to learn the music that they are singing without the use of a recording or without having to rely exclusively on a recording to learn their music. And then, of course, there's also the really obvious thing, which is that it's harder for singers to sight read because it's simply due to the nature of the vocal instrument, right? Because the vocal instrument does not have keys or strings or valves or anything else that you can physically manipulate to predictably and consistently produce the pitches that you want, right? When you go up to the piano and you play an E, the piano plays an E. And however in tune the piano is how in tune the piano is, and, that's not the player's fault, right? Um, but that is not true for singers because unless a singer has perfect pitch, they probably don't have any idea what notes they are singing at any given time. They don't know if they're singing a C natural or an E flat or whatever. And this idea is, completely foreign to an instrumentalist because instrumentalists know they're on their instruments what, how to place a finger on the string to get the E flat. Or a pianist knows which key on the piano is going to get an E flat. A trumpeter knows what combination of valves is going to get him an E flat. Singers have no such thing. So it is harder for them to learn to sight read because they don't have a physical instrument to control in that way. So that is why, I think that sight singing needs to be taught differently, especially to singers. But again, that is another whole conversation. So, for singers, young singers who don't have any collegiate aspirations or professional aspirations, this might all be fine, right? They might not necessarily need to become proficient sight readers. They may not necessarily need all this music theory. But if they want to go to college for music, then they absolutely do. And so there has to be a way that these young singers can get this level of training built earlier, sooner, before they go to college. There has to be a way to do that. And I'm going to, talk about some things in that arena later. But this is why. This is why instrumentalists have such an inherent advantage over singers when it comes to their uh, basic musicianship skills, because instrumentalists get a ton of immersion, musical immersion. Remember, we're going back to our language learning analogy. They get a ton of musical immersion built into their private study. They are solidifying basic musical building blocks while also becoming proficient technically on their instrument. So, of course, they don't get everything right in their private study, which is why obviously instrumentalists need to go to theory class too, and they need to go to oral skills class too. They need all that stuff because, simply looking at music from the lens of one single instrument is necessarily going to be limiting, no matter what that instrument is. So you don't get everything, but they have much more systematized ways of engaging with the music and learning about music, which affords them this opportunity over a period of years to let things steep really deeply, especially if they're practicing, intentionally, like mindfully, and, being good students and all of that. And this is why many voice students, again, even the singers who have taken lessons for years, they have great vocal potential, they're great stage actors, they might have really good technique. They embark on their college learning journey and they struggle with these things. And it's because they haven't had the same structural advantages in their training as instrumentalists have. And they haven't yet, as a result, developed the tools required to synthesize and use the overwhelming amount of information that they are learning. And rather than being given a timeline of many years for these concepts to sink in, like their instrumentalist, peers have had, their learning time for these skills is like far too compressed for them to be able to synthesize and apply them as fully and as deeply as their lives as professional musicians will require. Even if they work as hard as they can, they're still going to be at a disadvantage, and they likely will be for a while. So, obviously the singers who work really hard in college, they're going to leave, with many, many new skills, right? Like they're going to be able to do so much more after college than they were before. But the music industry, the classical singing industry especially, is so competitive. And especially right now, it is saturated with singers. It is saturated with singers coming out of conservatory and looking for work. And that means that any skill deficiencies become apparent very, very quickly. Because when you have many, many singers competing for a job, and you have many who are excellent, many who are pretty good, and many who, are unfortunately below that, you're going to choose from the group up here. Even if you're in the group here, you're at a disadvantage because that is how competitive things are. So I think that is partly where this dumb singer stereotype comes from. It comes from the fact that we have tons of singers entering the industry right now looking for work, and they when you have that volume and that many people to compare skills with, skill deficiencies become apparent very, very quickly. Now, of course, the singers, they're not dumb, right? They are not actually dumb. Many of them are really smart. Many of them are really eager. They are good collaborators. They conduct themselves professionally. But in the eyes of the music industry and the people hiring you, where there, again, are many, many singers who could fill a single role, none of those things make up for a deficiency of skill. None of those things make up for deficiency of skill because musicians in the professional world, they are hired to produce results. And if you do not have the skills required to produce the results, you're not going to get hired. So, this is not to say that, people can never catch up because of course they can. Because I know people who started from square zero in college in terms of formal musicianship training, and now they're doing just fine in their field as professional singers. But those are the people who are they are just fiendishly hard workers. They are tenacious and bold. They are curious people. And probably, more importantly, they recognize that failure and mediocrity and apathy are not options. So they are committed to developing whatever skills are necessary to do whatever they want to do, whatever they have been called to do as artists. And this is the difference between the singers who I see succeeding and the singers who I see, kind of struggling to catch up. These people know that mediocrity is not an option. These people haven't seemed to realize that. These people know that excellence is the standard. These people somehow think that they can get by with less excellence. All right. So, what we can do about this, that is, a multifaceted question, obviously, right? That probably merits its own discussion, like its own separate live. Maybe I should do a live about that some other week. But I think that there are some really simple solutions that we can explore or at least propose. And just like with the training and how I started with collegiate level training and went backward, I'm going to start with the professional industry level world here and work backward from there. All right. So, first, to all the non singers out there, singers hate the dumb singer stereotype. It is like so old and tired. And it's also insulting, frankly, especially to those of us singers who have musical skills. And even the ones who do not, but are really trying and are really committed to building those skills. The dumb singer thing, just like it needs to go. It is just astounding that this label continues to persist. So we have to just nip this in the bud. So first, I'm going to talk to the instrumentalists here. The first thing you need to do is stop assuming that singers have subpar skill sets. Okay. I mentioned before at the beginning of this live that, that I lost count of the times that I've walked into a gig or a rehearsal and I meet the director for the first time and they assume that I'm going to need a lot of help and a lot of hand holding and that I can't learn music and that I can't sight reading, and this and, everything. And then they're like astounded when, I actually show that I can do these things, that I can execute, that I can get the results that I've been hired to produce. Right. So instrumentalists, like these many conductors and directors I've had over the years who just assume that singers don't have skills, you need to stop that. Until a singer proves otherwise, you must assume that they are a competent musician who has the job, the skills to do the job in front of them. All right. Second thing, stop using that phrase, singers and musicians. Just stop it. I realize that, it's not always said with bad intent. Sometimes it's just how it comes out. I get it. But many singers take issue with this and they find it very offensive because it implies that they are not musicians. So instead, please say singers and instrumentalists. I know it's more of a mouthful, but please say it. Or just say musicians if you are afraid of slipping up and creating a false dichotomy here. Just everyone is a musician. Anyone who makes music is a musician. You can't go wrong with the term musician. Okay. And third thing, again, coming from an instrumentalist turned singer background, I want more instrumentalists to understand that singers have very different ways of approaching music and approaching their artistry than instrumentalists do. And this does not make them dumb. It is just because the nature of their instrument is different and requires a different perspective and a different use of the brain and a different use of the body, frankly, to make artistry happen. And having been both during my life and worked with both worked with students who have both an instrumental and a vocal background, the way that they approach these things is very, very different. So, instrumentalists, if you are unclear about what a singer is doing or why, just ask, right? Don't just roll your eyes and assume that it's a dumb singer thing and they don't know what they're talking about just because they might use different terms, different vocabulary or a different approach or something. All right. So that's for you, instrumentalists. Now, to the singers, you're not excused. You are not excused, period. And by that, I mean that just because you might not have had the depth of training that some of your instrumentalist colleagues have had, you are not absolved from the responsibility of cultivating the skills required to produce the results you've been hired to produce. Okay, you must be able to sight read accurately when necessary. You must be able to sing in tune without help from accompaniment or another instrument. You must show up to gigs and rehearsals adequately prepared, having learned your music inside and out beforehand. You must be able to speak articulately about the music that you sing. And you must be a professional and a cordial collaborator and all of the rest. If you do not have these skills, if you don't have what's required to do the job, then turn the job down. Turn it down until you have the skills to be able to do it. So don't take work for which you are not skilled. We already see way, way too much of that happening in the classical singing world, particularly in the choral gig circuit, where I spend a lot of my time as a singer. Don't take a job for which you don't have skills. Instead, spend some time learning the skills that you need to succeed and learn them quickly so that you can take this kind of work. Because remember, failure and mediocrity and apathy are not options. Excellence is the standard. Excellence is here. If you are here, you've still got a ways to go. All right. And then finally, to voice teachers, directors, conductors, other people who might be in like positions of authority over singers, I want you all to stop enabling and excusing and writing off bad musicianship or mediocre musicianship in your singers. Okay? Do not accept that as the standard. Do not accept it as the cost of doing business. Do not continue to view it as like a lower order concern. I want you to keep your standards as high for singers as you do for instrumentalists all the time. There's no excuse. So that's at the industry level. At the collegiate level, again, this is very multifaceted, and I think that there is, a lot of room for reform in academic music curricula, like across the board, not just with skills, but with other things too. However, one way that I think that we could help to address the disparities in musical background would be to have some kind of music theory prerequisite for all incoming college freshmen. Because I think that if they can begin their college studies already having the basics of music theory under their belt, it would give them a leg up and a lot more confidence, frankly, as they embark on the college journey. This would not solve the issue of sort of the years-long steeping and immersion process, but it would at least give them something to build on when they get thrown into their first college theory class. Also, having the basics of theory 1 sort of already taken care of and, the ability to jump right to theory 2 in college would free up a whole semester's worth of time in the curriculum that you could use for other useful classes, right? Everyone's always talking about like, oh, academia doesn't have enough of this, or like we should incorporate this, this, and this into musical training. And the response is usually, well, curriculums are already chock full of stuff and too rigorous, and there's no time to cram that into 4 years. Well, here's a solution. Get one semester of theory out of the way beforehand and devote that semester to something else. So I'm not talking about placement exams here. Um, right now, a lot of schools have placement exams where students have the opportunity to waive theory 1 and jump right into theory 2 if they are skilled enough or capable enough. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about all applicants being required to prove proficiency in music theory 1 as a condition of acceptance. So this is not the first time that I have brought this idea up, and I'm also not the only one to have proposed this idea. I have seen this idea floated from other colleagues in the space who have worked in academia. However, when I wrote something about this in a Facebook post in fall of 2024, a lot of people came at me and said that I was being racist, I was being classist, I was being colonialist because, like underprivileged students would not have access to like that kind of education and it would create all this inequity. I'm not saying that there's no inequity in the college admissions process. In fact, I think the college admissions process in any field, in any discipline, is a place where inequity does rear its ugly head. And music is just one such field. But I would like to address that here just by highlighting a couple of things. And the first is that obviously, if you're going to college for music, you are expected to have a level of proficiency at an instrument already, right? Um, you are expected to have enough skill to pass an audition. And if you can play an instrument, and even if you are a singer without a strong music theory background, it presupposes that you know something about music theory. You don't know probably zero, right? So we would simply be asking them in a formal way to show basic proficiency in an area where where a lot of incoming freshmen already have some level of skill. And if there are gaps, the gaps can be filled in a lot of different ways. For example, there are classes at many high schools now for music theory. There are classes at community colleges. There is a wealth of free information online. There's also online courses that you can, purchase and learn from. At the very least, there are textbooks available for, even used textbooks. You can go to the library. You can get something from Amazon. Get a resource that you can at least read and start to familiarize yourself with these concepts. So, in other words, learning the basics of music theory 1 before going to college does not have to break the bank. And I think is not an imposition, considering the fact that we already expect these students to have a very high level of proficiency of skill on whatever instrument they are choosing to study. Um, the other thing, like you could argue already that that requirement of proficiency, like disadvantages underprivileged kids, right? Because learning how to play an instrument at a serious level usually costs some amount of money. It requires having a home life that is stable enough that the student is able to practice and all of this. But nobody is saying that we should abolish standards of instrument proficiency just because it disadvantages underprivileged kids, right? I think that argument when we're talking about music theory just doesn't hold any water. But the best way for them to become conversant in all of this, again, is to teach it to them early on. And, it can happen through immersion and osmosis as you study an instrument. But it can also happen, more sort of like unintentionally or in like organically, I guess. I think back to my own experience, not only did I have formal training in these things in music theory and oral skills and all of that. But, at home, a lot of my free time was spent just like fooling around at the piano. In fact, piano was like sometimes a procrastination tool for like not having to do violin. But I enjoyed, just like playing around in the piano and playing whatever I could get my hands on. And I didn't have formal piano training. I didn't have good piano technique. I didn't know what any real fingerings were. But I knew how to read both the clefs and I knew where the notes were in the keyboard. So I played all kinds of stuff. I played, my favorite Broadway things and like movie music and church music and like whatever classical things my parents had lying around. I this like sense of musical curiosity that should really be fostered. Um and I think that, young musicians need both the formal and the very sort of like curiosity based, play based, informal way of engaging with music to really get these concepts to solidify. Because you learn all the stuff, like, you learn all the theory and all the building blocks, and then if you allow yourself an environment where you can, not have any pressure on yourself to do things right, but simply to explore and discover things, that's really where those building blocks, start to take hold. So, there are a lot of, voice teachers and choir teachers who are doing a lot to teach their young singers, like, how to sight read and, teach them the basics of music theory. Uh, and that's amazing. That is, like, a wonderful start. Um, but it's also not enough. It's not enough, and it's not because the teachers are not skilled, and it's not because the methods are flawed, but again, it's simply because, a few minutes a week devoted to music theory or sight singing in your voice lesson, or in choir class at school, it's not enough to develop the proficiency that you need to be able to have a leg up when you go to a college music program and you're thrown into music theory, a fast paced, rigorous curriculum for the first time in your life. So, if you're going to teach these things, like, students need ways of reinforcing things at home. They need, like, some kind of assignment or homework. And also they need, like, hands-on experience with an instrument they can see and touch, ideally, I think, in an ongoing fashion. Like, my parents had that piano in our house, even though I was, playing the violin and getting formal training on the violin. That piano was, like, really crucial for me in building a lot of these skills. And I think students need that. They need that in order to have these concepts grow in them over time. So I think that voice teachers who are able to teach their young students piano skills should absolutely do that at every opportunity. And, you don't have to teach them high level piano technique. Again, I had, like, zero piano technique, growing up. Um, they don't even have to be skilled enough to, like, play their own vocal repertoire, unless they want to do that. They only need to learn, like, really basic things, like major and minor scales, what the key signatures are, and maybe, like, a couple of really easy pieces, that will help them internalize some of these things and look at things like musical form and rhythmic structures and gestures and that kind of thing. So that's something that voice teachers, I think, can do. Just, getting your students acquainted with the keyboard and making them do a little bit of piano in their voice lessons. Choir teachers, obviously, their job is a lot more difficult, because teaching any kind of skill at scale, is harder. And I realize that, and I have a lot of respect for that. Um, there's also the very obvious thing, which is that, like, not all school age choir students, will wanna pursue music at a high level. Some of them don't even wanna be in choir, you know? And so balancing all of this, it's again, I do not envy that, and I have a lot of respect for people who are doing that. But I think that there has to be some way that choir teachers can reach those students, who are interested in pursuing music at a higher level. If they express interest at going to college for music or doing it as a career, they need to be something needs to be done for these students so that they can start developing the requisite skills. So, if the school doesn't have a music theory class, maybe something like a music theory workshop, like an intensive, over the course of, say, a couple of weekends, or like a week or two after school or something, to jumpstart some of these skills, would be a really, really good thing. And it would build on what they're already learning in choir. But I think also, again, fostering that musical curiosity aspect in students is so, so important. Letting them just experiment with music, play with music, explore music and how it works. Um, those things, like that kind of time with an instrument, is, like, so, so valuable. So, encouraging them to go beyond what is required of them. My piano hobby was driven by that kind of curiosity, right? And when I think about some of the best musicians that I know, colleagues who are just brilliant, brilliant people, a common thread that I see among them is, like, this fascination with music and this, like, insatiable curiosity about music and everything about it, you know? I think that students should be encouraged, to explore that as much as they can, as much as possible. And if you're a teacher or you know, um, a singer yourself, a musician yourself, like, show these young people what fascinates you about music. Like, why do you think it's so cool? What do you love about this particular piece? What do you think is amazing about it? Share with them, share these things with them because that helps them cultivate a growth mindset, you know? Um, we need growth mindsets for everything we do in life. We need the desire to be lifelong learners. Whether we choose to study music or study anything else, we need growth mindsets for our health and wellness, for our spiritual lives, for our family lives. Like we need growth mindsets for all kinds of things in life. And cultivating that through music is a good way for students to understand what that is and then apply that to other areas of their life. So I think that is one of the most important things that we can do because it helps them experience, wonder. I think it helps them develop critical thinking skills and observation skills. And, it creates like a deeper, fuller appreciation for the discipline that they are studying. So, that brings us to the end for today. I know this was kind of a long one, but thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. If you liked this video, you can follow or subscribe to my Substack and read about all of the musical education things that I have there, all of the singing related things I have there, vocal pedagogy. I would love to have you as part of the community and to hear more from you about what you enjoyed about this live and what you enjoy about the content that you see. So thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you on the next live.